Hello, this is Lee Markum, and I am back doing a live stream today, and I'm going to talk about migrating SQL Server. I've done quite a few migrations for SQL Server since I got started back in 2008 in the IT industry. So I just want to give you a quick overview of what my process is, and there'll be a lot of tips and tools and things that I'll mention here that you're going to want to take note of and take a look at after the broadcast. So the first thing that I do is I run the database migration assistant against my source SQL Server. This assistant from Microsoft will do an evaluation of your source system. It will find breaking features, things that have been deprecated, things that are on the list to be put to sleep, so to speak, that are going to go away. And you're going to want to take careful stock of that list and fix those particular issues. You're going to have a report of incompatibilities and any kind of breaking changes that are in relation to your target version and edition that you are going to try to migrate to. The next thing I would do is be sure that Query Store is enabled on your source system. Now, you can only do this, obviously, if you're on a version that's new enough where Query Store is available. You have to be on SQL Server 2016 and above to get Query Store. So if it's there, if it's an option for you, I would encourage you to turn it on because you're going to be using that later as part of testing. The next thing you're going to want to do is create a fresh test environment that has your new operating system and your new SQL Server version installed. Often when you're upgrading, you're also not just changing your SQL Server version, but you're changing the operating system as well. So you might be moving from Windows Server 2012 up to 2019 or even 2022, and you want a fresh environment to do that in. So create a fresh test environment with your new operating system and your new SQL Server version that you have installed. Run your application code against this new test environment where you've already restored your databases. And don't change the compatibility level yet. Then change the compatibility level up to the level that matches the SQL Server version that you're on. So for 2019, that would be 150. And then run your tests again, retest the application. And then you can do comparisons in Query Store, because when you restore your databases from your source to your test environment, your test target environment, the Query Store data from production comes with it. So you have all this good data of Query Store from production. You run tests on the new hardware, the new operating system, the new SQL Server version. Then you up the compatibility level and you test again, and you essentially have 3 sets of data to compare to: what prod looks like now, what your new production would look like with no other changes other than the operating system, hardware, and your version, your SQL Server version, and then another set of test code or test results from after you change compatibility level up to the highest level. Keep in mind that if you are moving from something lower than SQL Server 2014 to something past 2014, when you change the compatibility level, you are going to be switching to the new cardinality estimator, and you're definitely going to want an A/B before and after comparison as part of that process. Also, I just want to mention, if you do run into issues with the cardinality estimator, the new estimator, please don't just revert to the entire database back to the legacy cardinality estimator. You can hint that on a query by query basis, so be aware of that as well. The next thing you do is, again, take a look at that database migration assistant, fix breaking changes that it found, fix those issues in production so that when you move to the new version, things are going to work. And sometimes I can do this on my own, but often I will give those breaking changes or review those breaking changes with the development team and explain anything that doesn't make sense or that people have questions about, or even that I am not familiar with. I'll go look it up, make sure I understand what the breaking change issue is, and then let let the development team take care of making the changes that they know that they can make. The next thing is plan to use a DNS alias to ensure that the development team and the business doesn't have to change connection names. One of the biggest complaints and sticking points about migrations is the concern that, oh, we've always used this particular name when we connect to this database or this SQL server. And if we upgrade, then the name is going to change. And there are so many places where it would have to change in order to make the code work. Well, if you use a DNS alias, you don't have to worry about that. So talk to your system administrators about the process of creating a DNS alias that you can simply point to the new target. That DNS alias is the current name that you use and that the applications use to connect. And so the connection names don't change. They connect to the DNS alias. That alias redirects the connection to your target system. I would also then use the migration as an opportunity to consolidate or remove old unneeded logins from SQL Server. Every time I've done this, I look at the logins that are listed in SQL Server, and I always find people who don't work there anymore, old logins that were set up maybe to test something and they were left behind. This is an opportunity to clean up the login section of SQL Server and just don't move stuff you don't need. That will simplify management on your target system by not moving junk that isn't relevant anymore. Then you also want to think about, do I need to do an offline migration or an online migration? Can I keep the application running or have a short window of outage, or am I going to need a longer window of outage? So a lot of this depends on the size of your databases, how quickly they can be restored. You can work around that by doing something like log shipping or transactional replication if you're fortunate enough to have a database where all the tables have a primary key and you also like replication. That is an option. But you need some sort of way of getting a warm copy of the database over to that new target for an online short outage window for a migration. Occasionally, I'm upgrading a system in an always-on availability group. So you might have 3 nodes, 2 in one data center, and a third node for disaster recovery off miles and miles away somewhere else. Or if you're in the cloud, you might have something in 2 different availability zones or regions. And what you can do then is add the upgraded OS and SQL Server into the cluster and make it a secondary in the availability group so that the availability group does the work of synchronizing the databases for you. Once you're ready to migrate, then you fail over to that new SQL Server and you're up live on the new SQL Server instance. Now, you do need to, if you're doing an upgrade, you need to set up at least 2 of the new versions, because once you fail, I'm going to say fail up to your new SQL Server version, you can't fail back down to a lower version. So for instance, if you're upgrading from SQL Server 2016 in an always-on availability group scenario, and you're going to go up to 2019, you need to add at least 2 nodes to the cluster so that you can fail over to the 2019, and then you also have a 2019 secondary sitting there so that these 2 nodes can fail back and forth to each other. And then you drop out the old nodes from the cluster. So that's one way to do that with always-on availability groups. The other thing you want to think about is you need to discover what trace flags are enabled on your source system, and then determine in the new version, are those trace flags on by default? Do you even need to set them? And the trace flags are important because they do affect functionality. That is the purpose of your trace flags. is going to affect how SQL Server behaves in all instances. In some cases, functionality for trace flags has been included in the database engine in later versions, and you don't actually have to set the trace flag. Another thing that I would encourage you to think about as a migration tool is a PowerShell commandlet module called DBA Tools. This PowerShell module will really help you migrate pretty much everything. You could just run start-dba migration and let it do your backups, move your logins, move all your credentials, your database mail, everything. That is one possibility. Sometimes you do, because of the nature of the steps you have to do it piecemeal and do some things at different times. But PowerShell and DBA Tools is a fantastic way to do database migrations. You can automate and script things so that things just run and you don't have to try to manually do things through a user interface, for example. You want to test with developers and internal application users after you've done your migration. So you've done a lot of testing before you migrate so that you can find regressions. After you migrate up to your target SQL Server instance, you're going to want to continue to do testing and find out from your developers and your internal application users at your company, how are things working? What roadblocks are we hitting? What things have errors? And you can look at your SQL Server error logs. You can look at application error logs to find this sort of information. If you didn't turn on Query Store before, for whatever reason, if you haven't done it yet, then certainly turn that on now. It will catch query regressions. There's a report in there about query regression that you can run after you've been up on Query Store in your new version for a while, and it can find out queries that have regressed for a number of reasons. Query Store also will give you the ability to force the last good plan through automatic tuning. So it can actually make some adjustments and changes for you when it detects plan regression, which is another reason to use Query Store. Post-migration, if you didn't upgrade the compatibility level at the very beginning, definitely plan on updating that database compatibility level to the most recent compatibility level so that you can get the full functionality of the SQL Server version that you're on. And those are my overview steps of typically what I've done for SQL Server migrations in the past. I really hope that you found this useful. If this sort of content resonates with you, please check out my blog at leemarkum.com, where you can also sign up for a newsletter that will contain just a weekly SQL Server roundup of tips, tricks, and news that I believe you're going to find helpful. So I appreciate everyone watching the video, and have a great day.